Welcome to Overheard at Frequency, a podcast exploring issues surrounding hearing loss. I'm your host, Colleen Chapman, and my goal is to bring timely and interesting stories about hearing science, advocacy, and innovation to our listeners. Frequency Therapeutics' mission is to develop therapeutics to regenerate hearing that may one day improve quality of life for patients with hearing loss. There are exciting new things happening in the hearing health space beyond hearing restoration efforts, and we'll cover some of those compelling stories too. In this episode, I speak with Carl LeBel, Frequency's Chief Development Officer, who is responsible for the strategy and execution of our clinical trials. In this first edition of a two-part episode, Carl and I discuss a new clinical study of FX322 we have just begun and how to learn more about enrollment in that trial. We also cover new learnings from previous studies and how we are incorporating those into ongoing and future trials, all with the goal of potentially bringing the first hearing loss therapeutic to patients. Hi, Carl.
Hey, Colleen.
It's great to be together. We actually have a very busy podcast season. I'll just walk people through how we got to this podcast. We sat down together and we realized we actually had two podcasts and that we really needed to break the conversation into. So this is the first of them. And this one will cover some of what we are finding in the clinical side of our work and the process of that work, and some exciting new news about where we're going. So, or what's happening right now. So let me start with your connection to the work. So I think a lot of us came to Frequency because the science was so exciting, the regenerative aspect of our work. And that's one key reason we're here. But there are a lot of us who are also here because we're personally affected by hearing loss, or someone we love is personally affected by hearing loss. So do you have a personal connection like that in terms of a loved one, and what is that?
I do. It's hard to imagine that any person isn't somehow impacted or knows somebody or has a family member or friend or sibling or whatever it is. In my case, it's my mom, who is 89 years young now. And I'd say probably when she was 75, she'd always felt young for her age. And then she started having some vision problems. And at the same time, I also noticed that she was asking people to repeat what they were saying often. And when I said, Mom, I think you might want to get your hearing tested, she said, I want to take care of my eyes first, because that's the scariest thing. If I can't see, I can deal with hearing loss. So that was her attitude then. And she probably went another 7 years without having herself tested and then fitted for hearing aids. And the day that she got her hearing aids put in, she said, my life has changed. The world is back. I can hear people again, right? And it's not perfect, but I think she said that she felt isolated. And with isolation comes a whole litany of comorbidities that I could see really taking effect on her. So I'm glad she's doing them. It's not perfect, but she's engaged in the world.
And I'm so glad to hear that. And we all have a personal connection. I think it makes us want to move as fast as we can to bring things to market, but bring them effectively. So your time at Frequency isn't your first time in the hearing space. You were actually a different company, and you've been in the clinical development side of biotech for 30 years. And you were on the West Coast and moved to the East Coast to retire. Your daughter went to school here, your grandson's here, kayaking,
Yep.
Baseball, a better season of baseball than we thought originally. So what brought you out of retirement to come to Frequency to work on what we're working on? What's that story?
Well, I know I'm bad at retirement now, so I've tried it a couple times and it just never works. So when I came back to the East Coast, as you said, I was having fun kayaking with my grandson, getting to spend more time with my daughters that are grown now. And I wanted to keep my brain still sharp in some way. So I have my own consulting firm, and I was doing a little bit of consulting. I'd been tracking Frequency for a while, but I couldn't really tell what they were doing. When I read the IND, I literally said to myself, oh my, I think I've made a mistake. I've made a terrible error in deciding to retire again. And I really have to be involved with this because I think these guys have cracked the code. And once I saw that data, I just couldn't stay away. So as you can imagine, it was a difficult decision to make, but it was the right decision. And I'm really happy that I've been able to be part of this team and that we've been able to make the progress that we've made.
Let me ask you a question about FX322. We've, in our conversations with the FDA, one of the primary measurements that we've focused on is speech perception. Can you talk a little bit more about why, what that is as an endpoint and why it's so much of a focus for us?
Yeah, that's an important question. So when we first did what we call the 201 study, this was down in 2018 is when we ran the study, and then we looked at the data at the end of that year and early in 2019. When we first saw the data, we, like many in the field, were paying most of our attention on the audiograms. The field sort of expected that if you're going to improve hearing, the place it's going to improve is you're just going to make the sounds louder for someone. And one might see that in their audiogram. The problem is we didn't really see much in the audiograms, but what we saw was, in some cases, dramatic improvements in the number of words that patients were getting correct compared to their baseline. And it makes sense to us now because after talking to many of our patients, when they say, I don't go into my audiologist's office or I don't go into my doctor's office and say, oh, you know what, I think I've lost about 10 dB at my 4 kilohertz frequency. They say, I can't understand what my family members are saying to me from the other room. People are complaining to me that I have the television on too loud. Sometimes I don't hear the phone ring. I don't know if I left the water running. These are all signals of the fact that there's a loss of function, right? But in the end, it's all about communicating. And so we had agreement with FDA as we were beginning to interact with them that we would let the data drive many of the decisions on the development program. And one of those decisions is, what's the endpoint? What is going to be the most important endpoint that we're going to use to show an effect? So we again have shared all of our data with FDA, and we've had discussions with them, and we're really pleased that we've reached agreement that the most important endpoint that we're going to be using is speech perception. And that's really important because that's what patients say is the thing that they need the most.
Exactly.
So
yes.
part of this patient-focused drug development program that happened a couple of months that was spearheaded by the Hearing Loss Association of America, the outcomes of that program were all about patients saying, I need to be able to communicate better. And the way for me to communicate better is to be able to understand more words.
Yes, it was so encouraging, not surprising, but encouraging to hear that as an outcome from the PFDD, that the patient's one area that they really wanted impact in was speech and noise and speech perception and clarity. So with that in mind, can you walk us through what you are seeing so far in terms of that endpoint and other endpoints with our outcomes on FX322 to date?
Yeah, certainly. So like we talked about, the measure that we are focused on and we've gotten an agreement with FDA on is speech perception. This is the ability of subjects to understand a certain number of words. And so we measured that at baseline, and we dose them, and then we follow them throughout the trial to see if they're having improvements in that. And so a couple of key things that we have identified in our studies, which seems to be consistent now. First thing is we see very clear, clinically meaningful improvements and sometimes statistically significant improvements in speech perception. They're getting more words correct. So how many more words are they getting correct? Well, we use measures like 10%. So an absolute improvement of 10% is considered clinically meaningful. That would be like going from 50% of the words correct, 25 out of 50, to 60% of the words correct. That's the difference. If you talk to Kevin Frank, that's the difference of not being able to use a telephone, and now I've gained 10% and I can use a telephone. Mm-hmm. That can have a big impact on someone's life. Another measure that we see, again, speech perception, but we've seen improvements in, is when we present noise in the background. We call it multi-talker babble, where someone will hear 6 voices recorded together. They can't distinguish what any one person is saying, but it tries to mimic a restaurant setting, or if you're out in public, and then you're presenting words at the same time. We've seen individuals in our trials show very meaningful improvements in what we call words and noise, right? Lastly, in September, we released some data where we were monitoring patients that were in our trial for a longer period of time. And when we brought them back approximately 10 months after receiving FX322, some patients were now showing improvements in their speech perception. That learning for us is telling us that we have to be able to design trials that allow patients to respond at whatever their own rate is. Someone might show improvements at 30 days after FX322. It may take somebody 3 months, or it may take someone else 6 months. We just have to design our trials so that we can allow the patients to improve at their own pace. And I think when you put those three together, it just spells success for the program.
Yes, and such a critical finding to know that some need that time to respond.
That's right.
The other thing that follows on that is the conversations with the FDA and FDA designating FX322 on fast track status. So can you share for folks who don't know what that is, what that means?
Yeah, so typically that's reserved for any unmet medical need. If it's a life-threatening or a life-altering condition, you can apply for fast track. And we were fortunate enough to be granted that designation. And what it means for us is that we get to have more frequent interactions with FDA. Those can be phone calls, they can be in writing, just written communications. And we communicate through our regulatory lead here, we communicate through email into FDA. So there can be email dialogues that occur. And so that's sort of what the activity looks like. So it's helpful to be able to interact whenever we wish to, versus more traditional programs that you have to follow guidelines for certain types of meetings and so forth. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing it allows you to do is when it comes time for us to file for approval, we can request what's called priority review or accelerated review. And those review timelines are condensed versus more traditional review timelines, which are usually a year. Once you file, it may take the FDA about a year to review and hopefully approve. In our case, if we can get one of those categories for review, it shortens the review process roughly in half. So those are some of the things to get, but we're pleased so far with the level of interactions that we've had with FDA.
That's great to hear too. And part of those fast tracking is moving as quickly as we can, but as effectively and thoughtfully as we can at the same time. And we have just begun a new phase 2B trial for FX322 with a more refined patient population. So it follows up on what you had just shared in terms of how we're starting to hone in. And based on all the studies we've done, can you tell the listeners and those patients who are following us what this new trial is focused on?
Yeah, well, I can tell you, we've worked for a long time on getting ready and designing this trial. It generally takes about, from the moment that you envision that you're going to do a trial, it takes about 6 months to the point where it actually starts. So we've been thinking about this and working on it for quite some time. We have this incredible advantage that since we've run so many clinical trials and all of that data we have been able to pool together to really give us insight is into what we were talking about, which is really beginning to possibly refine that patient population. And as I said before, we are focusing in on certain etiologies of hearing loss and a certain severity range of hearing loss. Those two key things really allow us to perhaps increase the likelihood that we're going to have a population that's going to respond to treatment. Okay. Now, this study is going to be the largest study that we have run to date. It's got statistical power in it. The primary endpoint is a measure of speech perception. So there's enough subjects. We're targeting 124 subjects to recruit for this trial, and they'll be evenly randomized into either FX322 or placebo. So that we believe that's enough subjects in order for us to see the difference between the two treatment groups. And we have to see how long it takes us to conduct the trial. We've got a lot of new elements into the study that we're doing, but we think are going to end up in being a high quality study for us.
Yeah, and I want to talk about those new elements and what's different about this trial. But first, I think one of the things most people will want to know is how do they find out more about the trial, and how do they find out how to potentially enroll in the trial?
Yeah, the easiest way to do that is if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, ct.gov for short. You'll come to the homepage and it says search. You just hit the search button, and I think in the other category, you just enter Frequency Therapeutics. And if you do that, you'll see the trial pop up, and there'll be a list of studies because Frequency has a number of studies that have been posted. But if you click on the most recent study that is posted, at the bottom of that page, you'll just have to scroll down into the support section. There's a link there that says, how do I participate in this study? So if you click on that link, it'll take you to a landing page, as we call it, and this is supported by a group we work with called Clara Health. And they will take it from there. They'll be asking patients a number of questions about their hearing loss, how long they've had it, and there'll be a full evaluation process that occurs all remotely. And then eventually there'll be some discussions that go on, and they'll have to come into the clinic to be evaluated to determine whether they do qualify. But this group would refer those patients that qualify to the closest site near them, because we're spread across the country. We have 25 centers all around the United States. So we want to make sure if you do qualify that we get you referred to the closest location.
That is all incredibly helpful, because we know that's one of the biggest questions patients have, is they're staying abreast of what we're doing, is how to find out about each of the trials. So I did say I wanted to talk more about what we've learned from our previous trials and how we're adapting this current trial and forthcoming trials based on that. Can you talk a little bit more about that, mitigating any risks or adapting to any challenges that we found came up in the earlier trials?
The most important thing about doing trials is you have to learn from every single trial. Even if you don't get the results that you were expecting, you have to be able to learn. And in studies that we haven't been successful in, we have learned quite a bit. And I would say the most important aspect to the program that we have grown now a greater appreciation for is this concept of what we just refer to as bias. And bias is really when you don't have the right controls in your study. And what we learned in the past is in studies that didn't work well, they only had a single baseline measure in them. So we really didn't have a feel for how stable was that patient's condition and how consistent were they in terms of performing on the tests. So what we've done now for all of our studies, and this includes the new phase 2B study, we have a lead-in period that has multiple baseline visits in it. And what we look for is, as I said, consistency in the test scores. And also the test scores have to fall within certain criteria for them to qualify. So by doing this, we believe that we've mitigated against much of the bias that we've observed in the past. We're going to continue to learn from this trial. But we think that's probably the most important design component of this study that's ongoing now. And we just think that it will give us much better controls, cleaner data. And we're excited to eventually see the results from this.
Mm-hmm. That's really helpful too, because I know on social media and elsewhere, patients and individuals with hearing loss were really paying attention to the last trial. And there were a lot who were educating each other of exactly that we are learning and we're moving forward. So it's really helpful to hear it firsthand from you. Another question I have is, well, you're known internally within Frequency as caring personally about the people who are on your team and really caring about them as individuals. And it creates a very strong ClinOps team, which is really important to the strength of our trials. But individuals who come in to be part of the trials may think of themselves as an individual in a trial, but you do become part of a bigger team, something bigger than yourself when you participate. Can you talk a little bit about that and what it means to be a participant in a trial?
Yeah, we've spent time talking to several people outside of the hearing loss field to just understand how do they think about the trials that they're running, how do they interact with patients that participate. Because we know if you have the condition, some people may be really desperate to do anything they can to get into a study. And I've spent time talking with people that do studies in ALS, in some of the psychiatric disorders, in migraine. So a lot of these other diseases, as they talk to patients, oftentimes through the patient advocacy groups, they really think it's important to educate patients and say, look, we think it would be great if you would be able to participate in a study. And there's a responsibility that comes along with participation. You've got to put your best effort forward. You've got to be truthful with what you're telling us in terms of how you're feeling on a certain day or what sort of symptoms you're feeling. Because if you're not truthful, that can really wreck the study. But importantly, you're part of science, right? You're part of discoveries, and you're part of helping a therapeutic that could advance to eventually become commercialized that could help, in this case, millions of people. So you can be part of that, and I think the responsibility, but the hope that you can bring, that you are part of something that can help this many people, I think is something that we want patients to know, and we want to partner with them on.
And we hope to have more news for people about exactly what that participation has meant, what the outcomes we are seeing are from more trials. And we have an event that we refer to as R&D Day that will have more news to share with people. And as I said, we could talk for hours about all the things that are exciting to cover, but we're going to break it into two. So the next time we come together, you and I will talk a little bit about some of that news from R&D Day and some of the information that we are really looking to share with people in much more detail. So I look forward to that.
Me too. I can't wait.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Carl.
Yeah. Thank you, Colleen.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Overheard at Frequency. Many thanks again to Carl LeBel for joining us. Please join us for part 2 of our discussion in the coming weeks, and be sure to subscribe to this podcast on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to hear more conversations like this one. Overheard at Frequency was created by Suzanne Day, Colleen Chapman, Jason Glashow, Michael Schubert, Dina Brug, and Zach Russo, with production, editorial, and design assistance by Greg Chen, Victor Burbison, and Zuri Lowell. Thank you for listening.